The office smelled like old paper and lavender, just like it had the last time I sat here 2 days after Solomon's funeral. Back then, Sabine Arlo hadn't said much. She never did. She simply offered her condolences, handed me a small folder of estate documents, and told me there was more to come when the time was right. Today, apparently, was that time. She pushed the envelope across the table like it weighed more than it should. It was sealed in wax. My name was written in Solomon's blocky, unhurried script, so familiar it pulled the air from my lungs for a second. I ran my finger along the edge before breaking the seal. Inside a 2-page letter and a single legal addendum, stamped and notarized. I read the letter in silence. No flowery language, no drawn-out sentimentality. Just Solomon being Solomon, direct, strategic, precise. Alara. If you're reading this, it means they did exactly what I predicted they would. I gave them time. I gave them rope. I needed you to see it for yourself, how easily power corrupts, how quickly smiles hide blades. Now it's yours. Not the burden, not the cleanup, the control. 92%. Effective the moment they try to erase you. I reread that sentence 3 times. 92%. A quiet, absolute majority. My fingers tightened around the edge of the page. My pulse didn't spike, my breath didn't hitch. I just sat there absorbing it the way I'd been taught to absorb critical data slowly, thoroughly, without panic. Solomon hadn't just trusted me. He'd planned for my exile as if it were inevitable. He'd watched the way Royce climbed charisma first, competence never, and he'd made this clause not as a reward, but as a safeguard for the company, for the mission. I folded the letter along the old creases and tucked it back into the envelope. Sabine didn't speak. She didn't need to. We both knew what came next. When I stepped outside, the air was cool and sharp against my skin. My boots crunched over the gravel with purpose. By the time I reached the edge of the parking lot, I'd already decided. So when Royce called me into his office that morning, I was ready. Royce Talcott loved his office like it loved him, back glass walls, curated plants, a spotlight halo over the designer desk. The view behind him showed the skyline of Palo Alto, but the reflection in the glass was always his favorite part. He stood when I walked in performing politeness like it was a TED Talk. "Elira," he said with that smile that never quite made it to his eyes. "Thanks for coming in." I sat without being invited. He glanced at the folder in front of him, a slim thing probably prepared more for optics than substance. "We've been evaluating some restructuring." He began, voice smooth-laced with manufactured sympathy. New vision, new direction. I nodded once. I wasn't going to help him along. He continued, "You've been an incredible asset, truly. But with where Ardentis is heading, we need leadership that's more visible, public-facing. You're brilliant, of course, but too technical, too private. Not enough brand-forward I finished for him. His smile faltered for half a second. Well, yes. He slid the release papers across the desk. A severance package that probably looked generous on paper, designed by someone who thought the highest insult was a graceful exit. I picked up the pen, signed my name without hesitation. The click of the pen echoed more than it should have. He watched me closely, waiting for a flinch, a protest. I gave him neither. "That's it," he said. No comment. I capped the pen and set it down gently on top of the folder. "You'll want to keep that pen," I said, standing. "You'll need it soon." He chuckled, uncertain. "You're taking this awfully well." I didn't answer. I walked to the door, steady and unhurried. He could keep his performance. I had the real script in my coat pocket. The hallway outside was quiet. Admins tapped at tablets, unaware the ground beneath them had just shifted. As I passed Danny at reception, she blinked at my bare chest where my badge used to be. I nodded politely, walked past the branding posters I'd never approved, and out through the double doors. It was time to remind them who built the foundation they just tried to bury me under. The first time I ever saw Solomon on furious, it wasn't because a prototype failed or funding got pulled. It was because someone had padded a clinical report to impress a venture partner. He shredded the paper in silence, then looked me in the eye and said, "Elira data isn't decoration. If you ever polish a lie, don't come back." That was our beginning. A lab no bigger than a coffee shop, secondhand centrifuges, wires, dangling from half-assembled systems. We slept in shifts, ate vending machine crackers, and kept a whiteboard full of experiments we couldn't afford yet. And still, Solomon insisted on accuracy, clarity, and intention. The mission wasn't flashy, it was focused. Make diagnostics smarter, faster, cheaper, everywhere. When he died, the soul of the company left with him. But I stayed. I thought loyalty meant invisibility. That by keeping things stable, by working late and speaking rarely, I was honoring what we'd built together. I thought if I could just outlast the chaos, I could steer it all back to what it was. But Royce didn't want stability. He wanted shine. The lab became a photo studio, beakers replaced with branded water bottles. Scientists scrubbed from the website unless they had media-ready smiles. My protocols were rewritten by marketing interns. I remember walking into R&D one afternoon to find a ring light set up over the microscope bay. Someone had wheeled in a camera crew to film a behind-the-scenes reel, none of it authentic, none of it sanctioned. They cleared the actual research staff off the floor so Royce could inject energy into the narrative. When I said no, he smiled and asked if I wanted to get with the program. I didn't answer him then. But I remember muttering under my breath as I walked out. They turned the lab into a photo studio. Solomon would have walked away, but I stayed. Maybe too long. Now the lights were still on, but the work had lost its pulse. People left without warning. Patents were delayed, emergency grant funding lapsed, and all Royce did was double down on keywords and camera angles. But some structures crack before they collapse. You just have to listen for the right sound. Royce loved the sound of his own narrative. The company's social feeds were filled with influencers in borrowed lab coats, smiling beside machines they couldn't name. He gave TEDx-style talks about biotech disruption and posed with drones in hangars that used to be clean rooms. Every other week, he rolled out a new partnership, usually with a lifestyle blogger or health brand ambassador, whose biggest credential was a 7-figure follower count. The science was background noise set, dressing for his spotlight. I stopped watching after a while, not because it stopped bothering me, but because I'd started collecting instead. Data, patterns, paper trails. I funneled a portion of my own severance into an independent audit, quiet, forensic, untraceable. Sabine knew who to hire. She always knew who to hire. Within 2 weeks, the file had started to take shape. By week 4, it was thick enough to snap a binder. Misused grant allocations, safety violations edited out of inspection logs, vendor kickbacks, travel reimbursements that had nothing to do with business first-class tickets to Aspen during critical funding windows, billed under stakeholder development. One memo outlined a lab equipment delay because Royce had redirected the shipping budget to finance a media campaign. And worst of all, 3 internal safety complaints from junior techs that never saw follow-up. One of them flagged a storage malfunction in the cryo wing. The other 2 left the company within days of filing. Sabine handed me the binder in silence. I sat with it at my kitchen table for an hour before opening it. Each page felt heavier than the last, not because I didn't expect it, but because part of me had hoped it wouldn't be that bad. That maybe, just maybe, he was only incompetent. But no, this wasn't ignorance. It was choreography. Royce was the puppeteer. He'd staged it all for applause. I closed the binder, exhaled once, and felt my entire chest still. He built this stage. Let him perform. Let him bask. I'll let him run the show a little longer until the curtain falls exactly where I want it. And I already knew what scene would end the act. I reread Solomon's letter late one night, long after the house had gone quiet. The paper was worn soft from handling its edges no longer sharp. I'd folded and unfolded it enough times to know every line by touch alone. But there was one sentence I hadn't fully heard until now. When people believe you have no power, they show you exactly who they are. He wasn't talking about the company, not just the company. He was talking about the people who thought they could reshape its DNA in their own image, who smiled at me in meetings while voting to dissolve the ethics board, who toasted over catered lunches while compliance staff walked out the back door. This wasn't about vengeance, not anymore. It never really had been. Vengeance is reactive. It's fueled by ego. This was different. This was alignment. Solomon had trusted me with something much more than control. He'd trusted me to preserve intention, to be a spine when the structure collapsed. I looked around my apartment boxes I hadn't unpacked in 2 years' notes pinned over old research drafts, a project roadmap I'd never had the chance to present. My whole adult life had revolved around building something that mattered, and when that building was hijacked, I tried to hold it steady from the shadows. That wasn't enough anymore. I made the call to Sabine the next morning. Her voice was calm, measured, as always. She didn't ask if I was sure. She only said, "It's time." The shareholder board would convene in 5 business days. Officially, it was a quarterly operations update. Unofficially, it would be the pivot point. I sent no warning, no requests. Let Royce rehearse his talking points and rehearse his grin. Let the lighting crew angle their spots and the interns shuffle the seating chart. He thought the meeting would be his stage again. But this time, I'd be walking in through the front doors with the binder in one hand and the company's future in the other. And I wouldn't be alone. The doors to the boardroom were cracked open just enough to hear Royce mid-sentence. He was in full performance mode, gesturing toward a slide labeled Marketable Discovery Framework. The screen behind him flashed with buzzwords and color-coded arrows that led nowhere. And by rebranding our pipeline as a community impact initiative, we've elevated our engagement metrics by 34%, he said, voice buoyant, almost giddy. The board chuckled politely. Some nodded, others blinked slowly, trying to look awake. I waited until he clicked to the next slide, a photo of a smiling influencer in scrubs standing next to a centrifuge. That's when I stepped in. The room froze. Royce's mouth was still open mid-word, but no sound followed. His gaze landed on me, and he blinked hard like I might disappear if he did it twice. "Elira," he said finally, his smile twitching, "you're not... this is no longer a strategy meeting," I said, my voice calm, steady. "It's a shareholder session." Behind me, Sabine stepped through the doorway, a leather folder tucked beneath her arm. She didn't say a word as she began distributing documents around the table. Each one slid forward with a soft thud like a quiet sentence being passed. Royce let out a short laugh, dry, uncertain. "I'm sorry, what is this?" "Some kind of stunt," Sabine looked up. "These are notarized documents confirming a deferred control transfer executed under Dr. Solomon On's estate. As of 2 weeks ago, Elira Vaughn holds 92% of Ardentis Biolab's voting shares." The silence wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. Royce's face drained of color, the blood pulling back from his cheeks like someone had thrown a switch. He scanned the room, waiting for anyone to defend him. No one moved. "You can't just walk in here and hijack a session," he muttered. "This is absurd." "No," I replied, setting my own copy of the trust on the table. "What's absurd is thinking a temporary title means permanent power." He looked down at the documents, lips parting, eyes twitching across the signatures. I took the seat at the head of the table, and I didn't wait for him to give me permission to continue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I opened the binder and pulled out the first set of charts, field reports and internal audits, detailing rising response times in our mobile units. Since last fall, our emergency deployment efficiency has dropped by 21%, I said, sliding the first pages across the table. 3 of those delays were tied to misallocated funds, money intended for trauma equipment redirected toward media campaigns. Next came the grant summaries. 2 missed renewals from the National Biomedical Outreach Fund. That's $840,000 lost because application deadlines were ignored. Why I held up a copy of the calendar from that month. Royce was hosting a brand influencer summit in Tahoe. A rustle moved around the room, the kind people make when they want to look composed while recoiling. I turned the page again. Exit interviews from 6 senior researchers over the last 8 months. All cited lack of direction, ethical erosion, and obstructed safety reporting. I laid down printed quotes, black and white, annotated. Then came the HR complaints, 3 in total. Filed, uninvestigated, buried. One board member cleared her throat but didn't speak. Royce was shifting now, arms crossed, trying to smile like it still worked. You're acting like a few paperwork oversights means sabotage. I looked him straight in the eye. This isn't about paperwork. This is about erosion. You didn't just neglect the mission, you rebranded it. He scoffed. You think you can drag this company backward, back into the stone age of lab coats and idealism. No, I said. I think I can return it to something that matters. Sabine slid the vote document forward. No one argued. Not a single board member hesitated. The motion to remove Royce Talcott as CEO of Ardentis Biolabs passed without opposition. He stood stunned. You'll regret this, he said, voice thin and shaking. I rose from my seat. You're not that significant. He didn't respond. Just grabbed his tablet, shoved a few papers into his briefcase, and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him like punctuation. I turned back to the table. There was work to do. The glass-walled corner office was the first thing to go. I had facilities staff clear it out by the end of the week. Plants Plaque's imported espresso machine. Gone. I didn't make a statement. I just claimed an empty corner in the old dispatch bay and set my laptop down between the flight board and the coffee station. No one said much, but they noticed. I didn't send out emails or hold a town hall. Instead, I brought Fergus back quietly. He walked into the hangar 2 days later, grease still under his nails, carrying a battered toolbox, like no time had passed. He didn't ask questions, just nodded once and headed toward rotor inspection on Chopper 6. That same afternoon, I pulled Tony aside at the end of her shift. She looked tired, eyes red from another overnight headset still looped around her neck. I have something for you, I said, sliding an ID badge across the table. It read, Operations Chief. She stared at it, blinking. You're serious, as sure as I am. You've been running half this floor already, I said. Her hands shook a little when she picked it up, but she didn't cry. She just tucked it into her pocket and straightened her shoulders, like the promotion had always belonged to her. There were no announcements, no spotlights, no catered lunches. But word spread, quietly, efficiently, like oxygen re-entering a sealed room. The next week, I brought in an external HR review team to re-examine every complaint filed in the last 18 months. Leadership training was reinstated, real training, not slideshow platitudes. Equipment funding was restored. Grant applications were filed on time. And every morning, I walked the floor. Clipboard in hand, yes, but not to monitor, to listen. One afternoon, I caught a junior medic watching me from the break room. He looked confused, like he didn't know what to make of a CEO pouring her own coffee. I glanced over my shoulder and said, "This is where real work happens." He nodded slowly, and when I turned back, the whole floor had started to feel like it was breathing again. The reporter's name was Janelle Hart, soft voice, no entourage, a legal pad in hand, instead of a camera crew. She asked for a quiet conversation, no fluff. I agreed only because Sabine reminded me that silence leaves space for someone else to write the story. We sat in the back of the dispatch bay. The hum of equipment filled the background like a metronome. Janelle asked about my return, about the board meeting, about what it meant to take back control. I answered simply. I spoke about missed grants, about frontline staff who hadn't had working gauges in months. I talked about the medics, about the work. I didn't mention Royce. At the end, she asked if I wanted to be quoted on anything personal. A legacy comment, she said, half apologetic. I shook my head. The article ran the next morning. No fanfare, just black ink and steady language. The headline read, "No credit, just flight, the quiet takeover that saved Ardentes." Underneath were quotes from crew members who spoke anonymously. One wrote, "It finally feels like Skyward again." Another simply said, "She didn't need to raise her voice. We just listened." The audits began a week later. Federal grant investigators reopened files marked resolved. Subpoenas followed. Sabine handled them like she was rearranging calendar appointments. Clean, predictable. Photos of Royce at luxury galas surfaced, captioned with travel expenses that matched suspicious ledger lines. Equipment invoices traced to personal accounts. One vendor publicly terminated their contract and released emails. People asked me why I hadn't spoken up sooner, why I hadn't named him, accused him directly. I never answered, because I didn't need to. Silence. Sabine said to me over coffee one morning, "Writes the cleanest legacy." I nodded. She was right. There was no power in dragging his name through the mud. He'd already done that himself. I had something else to protect, and that was moving faster than ever. 1 year later, the sound of laughter had returned to the halls of Ardentes, not the forced kind that echoed after nervous meetings, but real laughter. Ground crews joked over tools. Dispatch traded old flight stories like baseball cards. No one lingered at their desks out of fear. They stayed because they cared again. We closed the quarter with record rescue response times and full grant renewals. A new trauma triage algorithm developed entirely in-house was being piloted by 3 state agencies. The tech wasn't just cutting edge, it was ours. Clean, functional, purpose-driven. I still didn't take the corner office. My desk remained tucked near the hangar entrance, where I could hear rotor checks and coffee brewing in equal measure. Each morning I walked the line in silence, nodding to the same mechanics who once thought they'd be replaced by PR teams and photo ops. They nodded back. No ceremony, just recognition. Near the east wall where the light came in, warmest hung a framed photo of Solomon. He stood in front of our first prototype chopper sleeves, rolled expression defiant and amused, like he knew exactly how impossible our goals had been and built them anyway. I paused in front of it as I always did. "We didn't just survive," I whispered. "We evolved." My reflection in the glass didn't look younger, just steadier. Less like the shadow behind the curtain. More like someone who knew exactly what the curtain was hiding and had chosen to dismantle it piece by piece. I touched the edge of the frame. "Your company became mine," I said softly, "and it still flies." From the tarmac, the low hum of a new-gen rotor spun up our first full-scale hybrid rescue unit, outfitted with AI terrain mapping and autonomous hover assist. It bore Solomon's old call sign carefully repainted by hand. As it lifted into the sky with a rookie crew on board and the canyon wind behind it, I didn't need a headline or a microphone. I just watched it rise.